one idea that I would like to see explored is to activate the Military Staff Committee, which is what the UN Charter actually calls for, in terms of UN military operations. The UN Charter's vision was that you'd have the chiefs of staff of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, and they would actually manage the Security Council's operations. The way things have worked out, instead we have this system where the Department of Peacekeeping Operations, which is part of the UN bureaucracy, manages peacekeeping operations. And so one of the areas where you get delay, particularly on peacekeeping, is that the Security Council will authorize a mission. It will then go to the Department of Peacekeeping Operations. They call up foreign ministries around the world and say, hey, who wants to contribute troops to this peacekeeping mission? You know, a couple countries will say yes. A couple months later, some other countries will say yes. It all takes kind of quite a while to plan. If you had senior military representatives of the Big Five, or at least, or even and other members of the Security Council, meeting on a regular basis to talk about how to implement Security Council resolutions, I think you could avoid some of that delay, because a lot of it has to do with, you know, who's going to provide airlift, who's going to get these UN peacekeepers into that crisis zone, and you know, 6 weeks, 8 weeks later, the Defense Department will be like, all right, you know, we'll send a couple C-130s to get them there. But I think if you had senior military representatives sitting down and saying, okay, how do we implement this resolution that we just passed? That could actually be quite helpful in terms of not only connecting Security Council resolutions more to reality, but also just speeding up this process bureaucratically. So I think that could be one helpful reform.
That's after the decision.
That's after the decision. In terms of speeding up decisions, I don't know that I have a good answer. I mean, Security Council decisions are hard-fought political compromises, and you know, I don't know what reform you could put in place that would make that go faster. I think that is just part of the, you know, central to the way the Security Council operates.
Sorry. Yeah, this might just be actually a wider version of the last question. I mean, with the concert vision that you mentioned, it's bringing the great powers together, and that's great, but the problems are still there.
Yes,
like,
problems are still there.
If we are looking for a great, for solutions to the problems, should we look elsewhere?
Yes. I think that's part of what I argue in the book, is that part of the problem with the UN is that, and the Security Council in particular, is that it's thought of as the answer to global governance. You know, it's thought of that it should be the answer. The reality of the world we live in is that we have a patchwork of international institutions that will all do different things. That sometimes one will be effective, sometimes another will be effective. The Security Council is not going to be the answer to the world's security problems. And so if you care deeply about Darfur, you should be thinking about other mechanisms. If you care about stopping genocide, you should be thinking about how to get a European Union rapid reaction force, or how to get NATO playing a more effective global role. If you are putting your hopes on the Security Council, you will be disappointed. Now, that doesn't mean those bodies have to bypass the Council necessarily. Part of it could be that the EU or NATO simply says, we're ready to intervene. Can we please get the blessing of the Security Council? And you know, sometimes you will be able to get the blessing. Particularly if they don't have to authorize a peacekeeping force, they don't have to pay for it, you know, some other regional organization is ready to play that role, then you know, it may be a case of kind of complementarity between institutions. But if you're looking to the Security Council to be the solution to those problems, I'm afraid you'll be disappointed. But that's part of the problem, is that we have this view that, you know, we're kind of gonna asymptotically approach, you know, an effective Security Council. That, you know, somehow every year we'll get better and better until we have effective world governance. And I just don't think the Security Council is going to do that. I think it's very valuable, but I don't think it's going to kind of approach that level of effectiveness. Yes?
Yeah, you talked about the two visions, the governance vision and the council vision. I'm just curious, in all of your meetings and interviews with the ambassadors, what did they go into the Security Council?
Yeah.
What did they expect to come out of it with, and how did they approach it?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it's not as if when I interviewed all these ambassadors, I said, hey, what do you think about this idea I have, concert and government? And in fact, a couple that I presented it to said, yeah, I'm not so sure about that. I didn't quote them in the book. I think, it's a difficult question to answer because I think a lot of different ambassadors entered with very different visions. Some of the non-permanent members, and I didn't talk about them much today, but the 10 countries that get voted on for 2-year stints, I think sometimes they go on to the Security Council expecting great things, that they will accomplish great things, that they will be able to kind of change the world through their service on the Security Council. And I think sometimes this manifests itself in difficult ways during council meetings. And I'll just give you an example. During the Rwanda conflict, as it became apparent that there was genocide in Rwanda, those of you, many of you will remember that during that period, this was right after the Battle of Mogadishu in Somalia, and the American appetite for involving itself in another rescue mission in Africa was precisely 0. So there was no chance that the United States was going to send an intervention force. But you had a couple of these non-permanent ambassadors on the council, including Colin Keating, who was the New Zealand ambassador, and the ambassador from the Czech Republic, who became kind of the voice of the conscience of the council during those debates. And they kind of stood up in council meetings and said, we have got to intervene. The legitimacy of the Security Council is at stake here. And some of the Americans that I talked to who were present during those council meetings remember being kind of frustrated by this, because was it going to be New Zealand troops who would go in and save Rwanda? Was it going to be the Czechs who would go in? No, it would be the Americans. And so the Americans said, we don't need this kind of pious grandstanding from the non-permanent members of the council. So I think you get some non-permanent members who go in kind of full of idealism about the institution, determined to kind of accomplish something on the council. I think the great power, the permanent 5 representatives, tend to be much more restrained in what they hope. But I didn't encounter an ambassador, including John Bolton, who I interviewed for this book, who thought that nothing useful was done on the council. I think they all thought that there are important things that you can get out of it, that you can advance your interests in a way that's cooperative with other nations on the council. But I guess I would say there's a pretty marked difference between the attitudes of the permanent 5 ambassadors and the attitudes of a lot of the non-permanent members. A kind of leathery realism on the part of the Big 5 and a kind of youthful idealism on the part of the non-permanent members. So that's a little bit of an overgeneralization. But yes, sir.
Yeah, I talked to Bolton some time ago, and his attitude seems he has hope in the UN. He said that it's evolution.
Bolton thinks it's evolving.
Yeah. And I have a couple of questions I want to ask you. You mentioned the chief of staff of the Security Council,
yeah.
How that position produced. And also, I don't know, you look into how many proposals become resolution, and what percent of resolution have been enforced?
That's a very good question. The first question was on the military staff committee?
No, the chief staff of the Security Council.
The chief of staff?
Yeah, you mentioned about.
I mentioned, the military staff committee is, the idea was that you would have the chiefs of staff.
No, I mean the Security Council.
Right, and the military staff committee would be attached.
No, I don't mean.
Okay.
Like this any office like White House, you have chief staff.
I see.
Like anything, and they are always a chief staff.
I see.
You're saying you mentioned it. No, I saw you mentioned chief staff of the Security Council. Did you?
I'm not sure that I did mention that. But
okay, then my question is: there a chief staff?
Is there a chief of staff? That's a good question. There is no. In short, is the answer, and I think that's a good question. The Security Council is staffed in terms of the people who kind of serve as the permanent bureaucracy, if you will, of the Security Council by the UN Secretariat. So the UN Secretariat provides the staff that prepares for meetings, that tries to kind of keep everyone informed, but they don't play much of a substantive role. They're really much more about kind of making sure the council meetings go appropriately. To the extent they're you could say the Secretary General sometimes plays the role of a kind of chief of staff and actually tries to negotiate a bit between the council members to make sure they're on the same page, tries to make sure that they have the right things on their agenda. But that's an interesting question because I think the council could benefit from something like that, something like a chief of staff kind of position. Now, on the question of council resolutions, one of the interesting features of council diplomacy is that because Security Council deliberations have gone behind closed doors increasingly, what happens now is that, in essence, Security Council resolutions aren't formally introduced until people feel like there's already enough votes for it. And so in that sense, I would say the percentage of kind of resolutions that are proposed that are passed now is probably quite high. Because in essence, people have talks behind the scenes before they formally propose a resolution. The question about resolutions and how they're enforced,
it's not binding. My question is, what's the percentage of resolution really enforced?
Yeah, and I don't know the answer to that. I have not seen anyone kind of try to tabulate and decide this resolution has been enforced, this resolution hasn't. A lot of them, it would be in a kind of gray area. For example, sanctions resolutions are sometimes kind of enforced, but not really. Sanctions imposed by the Security Council are often quite leaky. And so you'd have to go through and decide, was this considered enforced or not enforced? But I have not seen anyone do that. I think that would be a worthwhile project, though. Yes?
It might show my ignorance a little bit, but I was wondering how, like, a country like Turkey,
Yeah.
or ones that are pivotal with alignment versus our whole concept of what's a democracy versus what's not,
Yeah.
how that relates to the Security Council. And also, a different question is the economics of where we pin our dollar to, or the amount of in-house funding, like Japan versus China and
Yeah.
that.
No, those are good questions. On the question of Turkey, Turkey's interesting because they recently made a big push there to get on the Security Council and succeeded. And that in itself, I think, is an interesting comment about how the world views the Security Council. If it is true that the Council is seen as outdated and illegitimate, why do countries push so hard to get on the Security Council? And they do. They do. I mean, countries mount serious political campaigns to get on the Security Council, and Turkey was one of those that did that. But your question also raised the issue of kind of democracy versus non-democracy.
And the alignment of the superpowers.
Yeah.
That they see.
And that's, I think, if some of you will recall that during the last presidential election, John McCain proposed the idea of a kind of league of democracies. Because I think his frustration and the frustration of some people is, why do we give this authority to the UN and the UN Security Council when many of the countries on the council are not democratic? But the answer is that, well, number one, we have the permanent five, and some of them are, I guess Russia's a kind of quasi-democracy, China's non-democratic. But in terms of even the rotating members, there's no requirement in the UN Charter that they be democratic, and nobody tries to enforce that kind of requirement. It would be, I think, not a bad thing if the General Assembly, in electing non-permanent Security Council members, were to be more serious about choosing countries that, number one, have good records themselves, number two, can effectively contribute something to international peace and security. Instead, in this new round of elections for the Security Council, who are we going to have? We're going to have Lebanon, which is in some ways still in a political crisis of its own. We're going to have Bosnia and Herzegovina, which is still kind of reeling from the conflict there. During the Rwanda genocide, the Rwandan government committing the genocide was on the Security Council, privy to all of the internal deliberations of what the Security Council was doing. So the General Assembly doesn't take seriously the notion that Security Council members should meet certain criteria. And I wish they would be more serious about that. Instead, what's done is that it's basically a regional rotation. And the African countries get together and they say, okay, it's Uganda's turn. They haven't been on since 1980. Or the next round, it's Gabon's turn. They haven't been on in a while. And that's just how it happens. And I think that's quite unfortunate. I wish Security Council elections would be taken more seriously. The economic question, is interesting because the UN budgeting and the UN in terms of its funding and dues is mostly done through the General Assembly. The Security Council actually doesn't really have budget power over the organization, which is kind of an oddity given how much other power it has. The exception to that, in a sense, is peacekeeping dues. The feeling among the General Assembly was that if the Security Council has the power to authorize peacekeeping missions, they shouldn't be able to charge the rest of the UN membership for them. They should have a special, Security Council members should have a special obligation to pay for peacekeeping. And so there's a separate kind of funding system for peacekeeping.
But also I was wondering about the power aspect of it in terms of you have like China on the Super 5, but you have Japan
Yeah.
as a rotating one.
Yeah.
And so how that works with our pegging our dollar versus not, and the Chinese actually funding so much and also buying up so much oil
Yeah.
in other countries, and then the balance of payments and.
Yeah, well, the truth is that the council itself doesn't really grapple with that, with the economic side of things very often.
Well, the economy is in the hand of the World Bank, IMF, and now it's
And the G20 is also,
WTO.
yeah.
But if you want to talk criteria, that would be a mess, such like a democracy. Who is democracy?
Yeah, you have to,
Even you talk about United States, okay. Look at Congress. Congress is very undemocratic. That's why I make a mess now. Other day I have make a suggestion that we should have a Congress reform. Yeah.
no, you'd have to get into all those questions about who's a democracy.
Yeah, it's
I'm
a mess.
I'm not saying those would be easy questions, but I still think the General Assembly could do a much better job of trying to pick serious members who can contribute to international peace and security and electing them to the Security Council. I don't think it's a stretch to say that, Rwanda in 1994 shouldn't have been elected to the Security Council, or that Bosnia right now, even though I kind of like the symbolism of Bosnia being on the Security Council, as kind of recovering from war, I don't think Bosnia is going to be able to contribute a whole lot.
And the election is very democratic. If you get a vote, then you be there.
Yeah. No, it is true. It's democratic in that sense, yeah.
I was actually at Nairobi Airport waiting for my Air France plane home for several hours during the Rwandan massacre.
Interesting.
Having been in Somalia and Angola, 2 peacekeeping missions, I always grappled with the idea that, well, NATO should be handling anything military or quasi-military of a multinational task.
Yeah.
Versus the idea that, well, we can mollify a lot of countries with a big cash dump. Where do you foresee the UN dealing with external issues like peacekeeping missions, things like that in the future? Other than the state, New York
Yeah.
policies.
Right. Well, it's going to be, peacekeeping's been an interesting thing to follow over the last decade or decade and a half, because UN peacekeeping, which during the Cold War was kind of a, it was it existed. There were peacekeeping missions that were launched during the Cold War. They mainly were traditional peacekeeping missions, where the blue helmets would kind of patrol between, armies. The post-Cold War, we get all these ambitious new peacekeeping missions where basically peacekeepers are trying to build states. They're trying to stop internal conflicts, set up elections, set up internal governance. Missions like Cambodia, Somalia, to an extent, Namibia, other places. And basically what happened is that in the early 90s, peacekeeping went through this euphoria and then this come down, where people realized you can't send UN peacekeepers into Bosnia and expect them to kind of keep the peace during a conflict. You can't send UN peacekeepers to Somalia and have them be effective in that kind of environment. So we're now in almost like a purgatory, in the sense that I think the euphoria about UN peacekeeping and what it can do is gone, but it's still a tool that's being used. There are major missions going on. There are nearly 100,000 peacekeepers out around the world, and they're important in Congo. Now, they certainly can't control the situation there. They're important in Darfur and in Sudan. And, again, they're often ineffective, but they're certainly an important element to the security mix there. I think peacekeeping is going to kind of muddle through in the sense that it will be used mainly for African conflict. And that is the reality right now, is that peacekeeping is mainly for Africa. And this is kind of a parenthetical. One of the great frustrations, I think, among a lot of African leaders is that I think they get the feeling that the international community is kind of throwing these institutions at their problems. You know, African conflict, throw in some peacekeepers, you know, maybe not enough, maybe not well armed enough, but let's see if that'll help the situation. Throw in the International Criminal Court, you know, have them indict a bunch of people. And I think there's actually a frustration, and you see this particularly as regards to the International Criminal Court, that, hey, why are international institutions kind of almost like stigmatizing us? Why is the ICC only indicting African leaders? Is there kind of some separate standard that's being used for Africa now? But you know, I expect that peacekeeping will continue. It will, but as I say, I think it'll be mainly used in marginal conflicts that are of marginal importance to the big powers. It'll be kind of a stopgap that's used to try to kind of staunch the bleeding in some of these places. I don't expect it will be huge. I'm ending up being depressed by my own presentation there.
Do you see it maybe
evolving?
Bleeding is the wrong term, but kind of swaying back to the role of a NATO-type organization, rather, and the UN going back to perhaps a more humanitarian, not a social engineering, which a lot of people do dislike, but the more of the humanitarian side versus letting NATO have more structure.
I do think there's been a real push to delegate to regional organizations, and you saw it in the Balkans with NATO. You've seen it now in Afghanistan. The African Union has been kind of delegated in some places. During the early 90s, they were delegating the ECOWAS, the Economic Community of West African States, to try to handle some of the conflict in West Africa. I think that will continue. And that ultimately, depending on the capacity of some of these regional organizations, may end up, as you say, kind of replacing UN peacekeeping. Because often it's better to handle these things through regional organizations than through UN peacekeeping, which is a difficult, expensive, bureaucratic. I mean, not expensive in the scale of Iraq or Afghanistan expensive. I mean, it's cheap compared to that. But yes. Sorry.
Three-part question.
Can you write this down?
How did it occur that of all the countries in the world, members of the UN, Israel cannot have one of the rotating seats? And if that's the case, isn't this inconsistent with the charter of the UN? And if it is, why didn't Israel go to international court to remedy the situation?
Okay.
I think this will have to be your last.
Okay. Israel has zero chance of ever being elected to the Security Council because Security Council elections are done by regional group and by the General Assembly as a whole, which is fairly hostile to Israel still. Not as hostile maybe as it was in the 70s. And I get into some of the really remarkable rhetoric in the Security Council between, Israel and surrounding the Israel issue. There's been some really unbelievable rhetoric in the Security Council that I talk about in the book. But, yes, Israel has zero chance of being elected to the Security Council. Is this inconsistent with the UN Charter as a legal matter? I think you'd have a hard time making that case legally because all the UN Charter basically says is that the General Assembly shall elect members to the Security Council based on their possible, something along the lines of based on their contribution to international peace. It doesn't say anything about a country's right to be elected. There's no right to be elected to the Security Council. So I don't know that Israel would have much of a legal case, and I think that's probably why they haven't brought it to the ICJ. Because it's, in a sense, Security Council membership is treated as a privilege and not a right. And unless you could prove that, Israel was somehow, someone was fiddling with the voting mechanisms or something in the UN, I don't think they have a legal case to make.
Something about you had to be a member of some regional group in order to even be elected.
Yeah.
And the region in which Israel exists refuses to let them be a part of that group, and so they could never even be on the ballot.
That's true, but those regional groups are informal groups. They're not really. They have no legal status.
There's nothing in the charter about them.
No, there's not. There's nothing in the charter about them. They're kind of informal clubs that get together to select their candidates for that region for the Security Council. So. I do not think there's much of a legal case there, even though I think it's frustrating that Israel can't be on the Security Council. But a lot of Security Council members over the years have said that Israel is the 6th permanent member because the United States has used the veto more than any other power since the 1970s, and that veto has been used overwhelmingly to veto resolutions hostile to Israel. So.
Thank you.
All right.
Mr. Bosco's book is available on site to purchase. Are you guys interested?